Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith. I didn't get the pre-welcome from John in the comments, so I do hope some of our regulars can make it to this August 30th edition. Hard to believe that September is on Wednesday. Anyway, before we get started with tonight's show, I do want to remind everyone that, of course, you do qualify for CEU credits if those are things that you collect just by watching tonight. So head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists as of tomorrow, and you can sign up and let us know that you watched the episode, and we'll get that all squared away for you. I did want to mention, of course, with September being around the corner, next week is the holiday Monday, so there will not be an episode, but join us back on September 13th. Also, a quick alert from Peter Johnson, who may or may not be in the comments tonight. Apparently some fall armyworm showing up in the very south tip of Ontario. So we'll maybe talk about that later. But tonight's topic is actually pre and post-harvest weed control. And there are all sorts of really interesting things happening right now. And I say interesting usually means something challenging or maybe bad. Hey, Ray's here. Anyway, sounds like John might have got a real job, Ray says. So maybe that's why he's not here. Okay, anyway, let's bring in tonight's guests. So joining me tonight for this discussion is Rob Miller with BASF and Tammy Jones of Corteva out of Manitoba. Of course, Rob here in Ontario with me. And Rob, I'm just going to tell everyone you live near Guelph because frankly, doesn't everyone in agriculture in Ontario?
It's the egg hot spot of Ontario, so it's all
Yeah,
about Guelph. So.
apparently. Yeah, and Tammy is in the very picturesque Homewood near Carmen, Manitoba, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so Tammy, I'll start with you very quickly. Just a quick update on, so as we approach September, don't worry, it's an easy question. Good, yeah, what stage of harvest / where are the crops at right now around your area?
Some of them are harvested. Everything's good to go, or bad to go, depending on how you look at it, because it has been very, very dry up until very recently. And now we're going to switch channels and go to that damp fall, I think. That's what I'm worried about for the most part. So as far as cereals go, we're quite advanced with harvest there. And in fact, some of the post-harvest work could start to be done or has been done in certain areas. Canola, we vary. It depended if it was seeded early and is off already. Some of it is swathed and starting to flower again, which is a fun topic that we could talk about if you want to.
Wow. Yes.
No, it's so great. Yeah. And then some of it is still standing and immature in spots and very mature in other spots, and all sorts of fun with canola. Soybeans, I would say I'm starting to see a lot of leaf drop, depending on where you are and when it ran out of moisture. But again, it's been wet, so we're starting to, lag on that. And then, corn, I don't know, later, much later.
much later, we hope. Okay, Rob, I want a similar sort of snapshot from you, but today I was driving past a cornfield and I could have sworn that the leaves were starting to turn brown and dry down a little. Am I seeing things or what's going on?
Well, depends on where you are in the province. So, in Eastern Ontario, been a little bit more drought the last couple of weeks. In Guelph, we actually caught a nice 1.5 inches of rain last night. So things are looking pretty good, but with the heat and the high humidity over the last couple of weeks, we're the corn plants and the soybean crops start to shut down. We have edible beans that are actually harvested right now, some cranberry beans that are coming off. But in general, and even this week too, the field right behind my house is a field of cranberry beans. It's probably going to go by before the weekend for sure. And so I would say in general, we're probably a good 10 days ahead of schedule, depending on where you are in the province. But overall, we've hit some nice rains. August has been a little bit dry in some areas, but overall, we can't complain.
Okay, and welcome here, Warren. Warren Schneckenberger is tardy, but here at least. So glad to see you here. Yeah, better late than never. And of course, I do want to send a shout out to everyone watching. Get your questions in. We only have an hour and it always goes by far too quickly. So make sure if you've got any questions for our guests, please do get those in. Okay, so Rob, you did mention cranberry beans already off. And with our first clip is going to be focused on the soybean crop. Some of these things translate, of course, into the edible bean crop. But with this speedy year, because we are about a week ahead, maybe 10 days, how many calls are you fielding a day of farmers saying, do I spray, do I not spray?
Starting to get a couple in right now, but I would say, that first field that was off, that's probably the first one that, just wants to be the first one on Twitter, just like the first one planting. But overall, they're starting to pick up last week and this week, I expect by the end of the week, there'll be a fair bit of beans that are looking to get desiccated, especially the white beans. Now, the cranberries always seem to be a little bit earlier, the larger seeded beans, but the whites and the navies are going to start coming here probably next week. We have some nice weather here, nice dry down conditions this week too, hot, sunny. We've missed the sun, so we'll take it.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, Tammy, we are going to get to the reflowering canola thing.
Yay!
Because
yay!
Yeah. No,
yes.
I do, and yes, Ray, you're right. The journey to clip one, which often happens, but this return to some of this moisture, I did see one farmer had posted a picture of canola that was sprouting in the pod, like it had actually started to regrow.
So there's a lot of that's happening. There's no dormancy within canola, right? So whether it's still in the pod or whether it's in the ground, it's not dormant typically. Can be some induced secondary dormancy if there's drought conditions, but we're not experiencing those at the moment. And so things that can grow will. The stuff that is flowering currently is either stuff that was swathed a little while ago and then has had this 4, 5, 6 inches of rain that we've been blessed with lately, or it was some of those, secondary branches that are just starting to come into their own. And with the unevenness of the crop, you're seeing flowers and dead ripe plants. So very exciting.
Yeah, very, very bizarre. In that, so we are going to get to the clip, Lara, my coworker, who is writing with that. So this clip, all these snarky people in the comments. I
was reading the black bean comment, actually.
Oh, right. Yes, with sour cream, red onion, and garlic. Yeah. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, that's fine. That's assuming you can harvest these black beans. Okay. Okay, but this first clip, though, this is Kankura, and talking about the difference between, of course, dry down or desiccating and weed control decisions in this pre-harvest to harvest window. So we're going to watch this clip, and there's plenty of things that come out of this that we'll talk about. So Jay, if we could go to the clip with Kankura.
Hey, we are here down at your Belmont research farm. I want to talk pre-harvest burn down on soybeans, because this weather really is starting to speed up that crop, and we're going to see some beans coming off before too long. What do we need to think about pre-harvest burn down?
Yeah, for sure. We got to think about pre-harvest burn down because soybeans a little bit different than corn. The soybeans are loving this weather too, but they're also starting to shut down. They're getting into that that period of photosensitivity is starting to induce that ripening and maturity. This weather is moving them fast, and it's time to start thinking about burning down some soybeans, whether it's to even up the crop and kill them off, or whether it's to actually handle weed escapes from the earlier season herbicide passes and try to clean up the field that way, which is a harvest aid pass.
Now, we've got a lot of variability, a lot of unevenness in here.
Yes.
What do we need to do from that perspective?
Yeah, so you can look at what's very important, first of all. There's a few layers to the decision tree in terms of how this pass is going to work. First and foremost, especially for conventional or IP soybean growers, talk to your receiver or who you have that contract with and verify whether or not you can use glyphosate in the tank mix. Glyphosate agronomically is a big help in the tank mix. glyphosate resistant weeds or not. Just a big help to have that systemic chemistry in the tank mix. So verify that with your receiver. And from there, you've got to look at what is my proper timing for the product of choice to burn down. So pay attention to pre-harvest intervals. For instance, a product like Aragon LQ, which we provide 3 days in soybeans, if you add glyphosate to the tank, turns into 7. So we need to pay attention to that detail. And also the proper timing for the application when looking at the crop is also important.
Right. Ken, talk about, I guess, weed control. What we're trying to do here as well is get good control of, broadleafs and annuals. What, I guess, what are some of the challenges out here? What are the things we need to be looking at?
Yeah, so let's start with the actual timing of application, then we'll look at the weeds. Timing of application, we're going to look at that soybean plant, and we're actually going to look at the pods. Let's not fall in love with leaf drop stage right away. Let's look at the pods. We're looking for about 90% pod color change. So the bottom pods, generally pretty far along, starting to look like they're ready to thresh out. Top pods might have a little tinge of green in them yet, but they're generally yellowing off and starting to senesce. That will usually, but not always, correspond with about 80% leaf drop. So you're actually, with a product like Aragon, you're using it fairly late. If you choose a different product, you need to pay attention to the pre-harvest intervals and the actual crop stage that you're to best apply that at. From there, you look at weed spectrum, what you're trying to do there. Some weeds, we can actually talk about this fall burn down pass as a weed control pass. Other weeds, we're talking more about desiccation. So for instance, it's fairly easy to kill off, even if it's a big tall red root pigweed, it's fairly lush and a good application at the right time with the right water volumes and good practices utilized, we could probably kill that big weed. We get into tall weeds like lamb's quarters and fleabane, they're woody, they're waxy, they're hard to get chemistry into, and that becomes more of a desiccant type application. If we get some kill, great, but at the end of the day, we're looking at a desiccation type pass there, and that's to mechanically assist the combine in terms of the harvest process, right? Get it dried off, get some of the juice and the green out of it, and make it a little bit easier to handle mechanically through the harvest process.
Ken, when I'm walking through my field this fall and I'm seeing weed escapes, weed challenges, should I be thinking about what I did last spring?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is just a good practice, period. As any producer, right? We should be having a chat with our agronomist or the agronomy people that support our farm business and our crop production system.
Let's be honest, Ken could have talked for another hour. Okay, so we're
He stole everything I was going to say. So.
Yeah, no, we have so many. That was just the clip of what we're now going to talk about. So, but I wanted to start with, Rob, definitely the caution, of course, of, especially with edible beans, but with IP beans as well. If you can use glyphosate or put glyphosate in a tank mix for a pre-harvest, what are you telling growers on that decision?
Well, number one is always check with your processor or your buyer. Majority of the processors and buyers out there will not allow glyphosate just because they don't want to limit the potential end use for some of their markets. There might be the odd processor that has it going to a specific country, maybe a specific bean type that can go to a specific country. But for the most part, most processors that we've been talking to are not allowing it. But even some other options like Ignite. Ignite was also commonly used, and it also isn't being allowed in some countries as well. So our number one recommendation is always follow the label and always check with your processor.
Now, and of course, we have... Yeah, sure, by all means.
Aragon. Okay, let's talk heat maybe when we're talking.
Yes,
Canada.
West and
Ignite.
East. Sorry.
I think we're talking glufosinate there, right?
Yes, that's Ignite is a formulation glufosinate and ammonia. It is used in our horticulture market, so it's much different than the Liberty brands as well. So same active ingredient, but different surfactant packages.
Right, and glufosinate can be used in Western Canada as well on a couple of specialty crops, mainly the horticulture ones as well. But just a caution, whether you're looking at keep it clean or what you're looking at, that, just because you know it works, and they definitely can work in some situations that they're not currently labeled for, those end use markets, regardless of whether it's edible beans, the IP soybeans, the conventional soybeans are wildly popular again in Manitoba, which is driving me crazy, but at the same time is interesting. Or oats or anything, canola that's going into, a crush market and is human consumption, very touchy in all of those consumer oriented markets. So yeah, definitely check with your contractor about that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Now, of course, there is the difference between a dry down, a desiccant, or doing something exactly that for harvest management versus weed control. So, Rob, we'll start with you, but then Tammy, of course, we're looking at a different weed mix when we talk east and west. So, in the east, where are we at with weed control potentially at harvest?
Okay, so I won't talk about Kochia, so I'll leave that for Tammy there. So,
Thanks.
Yeah.
But for the most part, what I've always said to growers is spraying a 4-foot tall plant, say a lamb's quarters plant or a ragweed plant at this time of year, is not weed management. That is a harvest aid tool. So we're just basically trying to burn it off to get it through the combine enough that it won't cause any quality issues when it sees the beans, whether it's dry beans or soybeans or any other crop. It's just trying to aid in harvest. It's not necessarily a matter of weed management. And I think the big thing is when it comes to selecting the right product, you want to make sure that you spray it on the optimal conditions. Something like regrowth might be a little bit more, like more overcast, cloudy days, and then Aragon with like more hot, sunny days. So Aragon, also known as Heat LQ out west, and then also Sharpen for the U.S. listeners there as well. So.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And now, Tammy, different weed spectrum. Certainly we have some species.
Do you want to bring up one of those big pictures?
I would, okay, which picture? Yeah, which picture would you like Jay
one of
to
the
bring
soybeans
up?
with a big bush in it, whatever.
Giant kochia trees, shrubs.
Sure, yes, those.
Whatever they are. Okay, tell us how to deal once it comes on the screen here.
So that becomes a real challenge. So this is a soybean crop, as you can obviously tell, soybean crop.
Yes.
And again, to Rob's point, the quality issues are there. Staining, the soybeans are just as bad as the edibles, maybe not quite as bad, but certainly a quality concern there, as well as just pushing all that material through. So these were, I took this last night, as you can see, sort of a sunset look there. And they were as tall as I am, so I'm 5'7". So I've always wanted to market them as Christmas trees, but never mind. We'll move on to that a different day.
Right.
Okay, so the extenuating circumstance here would be that regardless of whether they are in a crop that can be accepted with glyphosate or not, that these ones are probably glyphosate resistant kochia, just based on the pattern in the field and how they were present. So then you are looking at an alternative to glyphosate as that. And there aren't that many options out there. So Rob has mentioned a couple of the important ones, whether it is something like diquat, reglone, whatever desiccant of that nature, or something like heat, saflufenacil, whatever it is, to try and drive it down. The important thing to note here too is that in an earlier maturing crop like a canola or something like that, where you've cut it off, there's a lot of studies that show that with our nice moisture and a nice fall open season there, that you can get lovely regrowth on that kochia and up to 4,000 seeds per plant that can be produced just from that cut off kochia. So it depends on your growing conditions and all that sort of thing. So it is quite important that while it may be a harvest ease and a quality issue that you're looking at, we can all, yes, Ray, I'm putting kochia into Weed Scientist Christmas stockings. That's exactly what we're doing.
If they're bad. Yes.
Yeah. But yes, so the problem here is that regrowth is important. So like Rob said, we need to make sure that our water volume and our coverage is doing a really good job, that we're looking at an appropriate date, and that we've got some good growing conditions. The surface, leaf surface area versus the volume of that plant, don't cut rates because you're not going to get control. Mm-hmm. There's so many factors in here that are just going to, make your head explode. So I've had lots of questions about, do you leave glyphosate out if you don't need it, or if the crop or if the weed is resistant? Sometimes the answer is still not no, or is still put it in there because you want the activity. Kochia has a nice outcrossing ability. So you do get some genetic diversity in there. So you might as well use the glyphosate to its fullest advantage, multiple modes of effective action, all that kind of jazz as well, right? So it's not as easy as just leave it out because it's not going to be effective anyway. Rob, you've been nodding your head. So what would you do here?
Yeah, I would agree 100% with the glyphosate-resistant weeds that we've been dealing with, and where we can add glyphosate. So if it's in the Roundup Ready market or the crush market where they do allow glyphosate, we still recommend it. It always sharpens things up and makes everything look a little bit sharper. And when we're dealing with glyphosate-resistant weeds, we actually say, it's going to take at least 2 weeks for them to dry down because the glyphosate's not effective on it, obviously. So if you're dealing with Canada fleabane or something like water hemp, those ones will take a good 2 weeks to dry down in optimal conditions. So drying conditions, not if it's cold overcast.
So we always, of course, talk about pre-harvest intervals. We have to, of course, because that is an important component to this as well. But I think Ken's point there was you always have to take the longest one, right? So if you're using one product that's 3 days, but another is 7, you have to go by the 7. But realistically, you also need these products to work. And so glyphosate takes a lot longer than a desiccant, let's say. And so you do need it to dry down because it's a harvest aid. It's not actually getting weed control so much as just drying down that material that's going to go through the combine. So I know that we run with canola. I know that we certainly run into some pre-harvest interval discussions because it's from the time you cut the plant, so swathing, not the time the harvester runs through the fields. The pre-harvest interval, right, is from when you spray until you cut, not spray until you put it in the bin. So that is very clear to remember because, of course, there are some insecticides and things like that we have to think about, right, Tammy?
Yes, and I mean it's great to have a tool like a desiccant that's got rapid dry down. I would think that there's going to be a lot of people right now that might be regretting that desiccant if it got applied before we got some wet weather, and then we see that crop degrade because it blows up the cells and dries everything down. Doesn't matter, doesn't care that you want the crop or not, starts to degrade everything. And so then you need to get into that field as quick as you can to actually harvest it while you still have some integrity to that plant, because straw starts to break down, everything starts to break down, the whole world breaks down. It's not quite that bad, but you get what I mean, that we've got that scenario where that desiccant is actually now your worst enemy instead of your best friend. So there's some checks and balances there too. And sometimes then some of those longer acting or slower acting dry down aids are more helpful, or would have been nicer in that scenario, unfortunately.
Right. Unfortunately, we don't all have a crystal ball. And frankly, the forecast isn't always true, you guys. Just putting it out there. I know.
I haven't believed the rain forecasts at any time this month, and unfortunately or fortunately, most of them seem to be coming true. And it looks like we've got showers in the forecast again, so we're looking at some more opportunities for replenishing the soil reserves.
Which that's the positive spin we're all going with, for sure. However, because it does mean good things for next year, especially if we get some snow cover out west and all those sorts of things. But it does bring up all sorts of challenges for this harvest season and potentially the importance of post-harvest weed control in some ways. So we are going to get to that. I did notice though, so I'm going to go out of order, which also happens. Thank you everyone following along. I'm going to go out of order on the clips because we do have a couple questions about weed control in going from soybean stubble into winter wheat. So I actually happen to have pulled a clip of Mike Cobra talking exactly about that. So Jay, if you can pull up the Mike Cobra clip, we're going to watch that and we'll get into some winter wheat discussions here, lickety split.
There's 4 main considerations a farmer has for controlling weeds in winter wheat, and they are to minimize yield losses from weed competition. They're also for improving harvesting efficiency if we can cover more acres per hour in a clean field versus certainly a weedy field. The third consideration is the cleanliness of straw, Buyers want clean straw. They don't want to inherit your weed seeds and weed roots for their operation. And then lastly, weed seed return. We don't want to let annual weeds growing, setting seed, and returning it to the soil for future years to come. So in a perfect world, we have a wheat field like this one here, where the producer was able to go in with a pre-plant weed control treatment to get rid of all the winter annual and perennial weeds, to get the crop off to a clean start. That's the best way to minimize yield losses from weeds. But what if we weren't able to hit that window? It's a tough window to hit. As soon as the combine comes out of the field, usually the drill's in there after. So if we have perennial and winter annual weeds now in our winter wheat crop in the fall, what do? Should we control it now, or should we wait till the spring? So let's look at a couple of scenarios, because the real answer is we need to scout, see what's in there, and make that decision. So let's run through a couple of different scenarios. So in order to figure out whether you should be going in the fall to control weeds or wait till the spring, we need to scout. We need to see what's in the field to begin with, because in the fall, the weather is a lot more unpredictable than in the spring. And so is a good opportunity for us to go in the field or not. So we need to scout for weeds, and I'm looking at right now a couple of different species here. We have perennial sow thistle, and this is several days after a string of hard frost. So nighttime temperatures got down to -3, -5. I'm about a week away from that frost event, and you notice here with perennial sow thistle, the leaf tissue is green. So that's what you want to look at when you're in a field in the fall debating whether to spray for weed control. Is what does the leaf tissue look like after a frost? And in this case, leaf tissue looks good. Sometimes that light frost triggers those perennial weeds to start storing sugars into the roots. So it's actually a nice time to hit them with herbicides, because it takes the herbicide down into the root. You'll notice here though, we have this species here. It's annual sow thistle. It's wilted from that frost. So the frost has actually killed the top growth of that. So clearly if you had species like this, hey, Mother Nature's already done the job for you. The frost has desiccated the weed. Nothing to do here. But certainly the other species in this field, we have some wild carrot, we have some cleavers popping up. So the perennials and winter annuals, leaf tissue looks green. From a benefit to the wheat crop, things like sow thistle, we know they get tall, they affect harvesting ease, so there's benefit to managing those now versus waiting to the spring. So here's another field scenario, and it just indicates why scouting is so important. So first weed I came across here, lamb's quarters. This is 7 days after a frost. Lamb's quarters isn't that frost hardy, so it's all wilted, black tissue. So if you have a bunch of weeds like this, you see the leaf tissue is all wilted and rotten, there's no sense doing any herbicide applications here. But there are other species that we have here. We have some chickweed and cleavers that are still nice and green, some dandelion and some sow thistle. So we see again some weeds here through scouting that definitely still can take up herbicide and be controlled. The big question is, what do we use? We know from experience there's herbicides that we shouldn't be using in the fall, specifically 2,4-D. So not only does the product label of 2,4-D say not to apply it to winter wheat emerged in the fall, other hormone herbicides too we probably should avoid. The main reason for that is when they're applied in the fall, the growth stage is usually small, just starting to tiller. Field experience in the past has shown that it can distort heads and reduce yield significantly the next year. So 2,4-D, let's stay out of that for fall weed control. So then you ask yourself the question, well, how do I choose a herbicide to control what I have? And so fortunately, there's a new tool out called the Pest Manager app that can help us narrow down our search options, especially when we have 4 or 5 different target weeds that we're looking at. So let's take a look at that app and how we can use it for this scenario.
Oh, my Cobra from 2016. Anyway, still some good info in there, though, of course. Wanted to capture that importance of knowing what your weed spectrum is, of course, so what exactly you're dealing with. But there's a few things I want to do, to sort of few angles I want to take from this. But Ty and Warren both had the same question. So soybean stubble going into winter wheat, weedy field, Canada fleabane, big issue. Rob, we'll start with you. What are you thinking? What are your options? Do you go in pre-seeding? What do you do?
So I guess it depends on if you have to do a pre-harvest in that soybean field to actually get the combine through it or not. So that's your number one thing. And if you're able to use glyphosate there or not, a product like Aragon, if you don't have glyphosate in that mix, then you're not really going to take out some of their perennial weeds. You're just going to kind of burn the top off. Then you're going to see them flush after harvest, kind of like what Tammy was talking about earlier. So with Canada fleabane, you have a couple different options. After soybeans, before the wheat's gone on in, and remember how Mike Kober said, it's a really tight window. But if you get it in the ground, you can use a product like something like 2x rate of Aragon LQ, so a 60 mil rate of Aragon, plus the glyphosate. And you can actually use higher rates of glyphosate when you apply it pre-plant. When you're using a glyphosate pre-harvest, you're limited to only a liter equivalent, so you have to use lower rates. But that would be the number one option, and you can actually get some short-term residual of those fall germinating weeds, so the Canada fleabane, the chickweeds, the henbits. Those would be the first option. And glyphosate's a little bit more broad spectrum. If the wheat gets ahead of you and you can't get in there, the wheat's already up, then you have a couple different options there. And definitely check out the Pub 75, that pest manager app, or Pub 75. And, there's products like Affinity, there's Pixarol, there's a few other ones that will help control it if the wheat's up. But definitely, number one thing with Canada fleabane, if you have heavy pressure in your field, fall application is the best. Don't rely only on spring applications, cool, wet conditions. It's tough to get in all those fields and time it properly.
Tammy, you're also nodding, which I was hoping the two of you would actually fight. So that's why I orchestrated.
What would you like us to fight about? I'm ready.
No. All right. So, similar question, of course. So we do actually put some winter wheat in the West, not nearly as much here as Ontario, and a different weed spectrum, like we saw with the Christmas tree kochias, etc. But what are most farmers sort of up against? And I do want to talk about weed size in the fall, because you made a mention about how cutting a
Size
plant
matters.
off doesn't make it small as far as immature. It just makes less plant matter. So let's imagine then that we're trying to put winter wheat in. How about in Manitoba? What's the approach there if we're dealing with weeds?
So I think winter wheat is an interesting one because it's almost a moral dilemma. You're trying to get into a clean field. Sometimes tillage is a fun way to clean things up. Lots of people like that in Manitoba. It's just something we do for recreation at times, especially when we have lots of moisture. But in a year like this, when we haven't had a lot of moisture and we're trying to minimize how much of that soil moisture we lose, then we're probably going into a more reduced tillage or direct seeding type of a scenario. And so if we haven't done that pre-harvest pass, like Rob was saying, then we can do a pre-seed. That, again, limited options, as we well know. But the bonus to that is that you're keeping whatever soybean stubble there is that might act like a trap crop for the snow to stay there, which would be nice. Not that there's a lot there, but anything's better than nothing, right? So that we don't have as much winter kill, because that's our biggest issue is lack of snow, winter kill, bad. So maybe leaving some of those annual weeds there isn't such a terrible idea. I don't know. I know, crazy talk. If we're looking at kochia, I don't care about kochia. If it's just germinating in the fall, which it won't be, but if it were, then that could stay there. If it's large kochia that we've cut off with combine, then yes, I'm thinking that we either needed to go in and cultivate. Honestly, I think that's probably the best way to have gotten rid of it. Of course, it'll blow off into the neighbor's field and they'll love you for that. But it's probably the easiest way to go. Sharing is caring. But then if you're looking at herbicide options, you're probably doing something pre-seed or pre-emerge at the very least to make sure that we won't get that. When it comes to cleavers, which can be a winter annual and definitely a challenge, and then, that's one that we're definitely going to want to try and kill in the fall, or flicksweed or narrow-leaved hawksbeard or all of those winter annuals, very different weed spectrum than what Rob is talking about, but nonetheless still ones that we need to look at. Then you're probably looking at a group 2 and a group 4 product somewhere together. The danger, like I said, or like we've heard, is that those group 4 phenoxys if inappropriately timed, are very dangerous as far as what's going to look at your yield potential next year and your head malformation, all that kind of jazz. So then group 2 products, we know that there's some resistance out there. And so then we try to put in a group 27 or a group 6 or something else to try and have multiple modes of effective action. And it gets challenging depending on what your weed spectrum is. There is, for me anyway, there is no one size fits all type of scenario. You have to go out, like Mike said, and scout, make sure you know what you're dealing with and try to work from there. So we know it's going to be decent moisture in a lot of areas. I expect to see lots of healthy flicksweed and arrowleaf hawksbeard and those types of problem weeds that we'll need to deal with.
Personally, I really like flicksweed because it looks neat and it has a cool name, but it's a giant pain because exactly that. It can be incredibly prolific. I will say it. I don't know, Rob. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but it does feel like at least Manitoba anyway deals with a lot of winter annuals. Like so many. And so that fall window can be a great way to get ahead of weed control next year. And so Tammy, I guess that is the wheels have been turning since we were planning this episode, that with this return of some moisture for the soil, also of course is potentially going to stimulate a lot of weeds to germinate and to grow post harvest. So do you feel this year will be a much more important year for fall weed control potentially?
Yes, if you wanted to bring up there, I did provide a couple of pictures of weeds that are already doing quite a nice job this fall after wheat has been harvested. So that Canada thistle, for instance, is one that we have a heck of a time with in certain crop rotations as far as dealing with it. It's a perennial weed instead of a winter annual. You can already see like some really nice growth happening, not even regrowth, not off, but just new stuff that's starting to emerge now that there's no crop there and we've got that great root system. So the disadvantage with a perennial like this one, for instance, is that tillage has the opportunity to spread the joy around and just make the patch bigger for next year. So that's the gift that keeps on giving. And there's a few perennials that are like that. Perennial sow thistle will do the same thing. And so again, as much as you want to try to have an integrated approach to weed management, there's always those checks and balances about what you can use and what you can't use and how you're going to deal with it. So the great thing about the biology of Canada thistle is that a really focused glyphosate application in the fall that goes down into the roots, just like with the perennial sow thistle, you're going to do a great job of it. And you can enhance it with an add in with your glyphosate just to make sure that you're widening the spectrum for some of the other weeds that are there. And also, depending on how you time it, maybe have something that still has some extended control in the spring as well. So there's lots of opportunities here, but there's always challenges with it as well. When it comes to the flicksweed that you love so much, that row that's laying there in the fall is really nice to kill, right? Because there's lots of leaf surface, the herbicide's going to hit it and do a great job of it, versus in the spring when it gets ahead of you, extend up, and you've got a much harder target to hit. I love the, I think it used to be the Latin name was Desiccation Sophia. I don't know if they've changed that because they keep changing these names on me. But anyway, so it's like flicking something off your desk. That's how I remembered the scientific name for very scary. Yeah, very, very nerdy. Anyway, some annual weeds I don't really care about. I do, like you do worry about weed seed return and that sort of thing, but it's usually minimal. Kochia would be one of the exceptions where you can get quite aggressive with it. But I'm not sure that I necessarily answered your question. I just circled around a bunch of things there, Lindsay. So if you want to refocus me, that's fine as well. Or Rob, if you want to add anything too.
That's basically this entire program. That is good. And it does bring up a couple of the questions that have come up in the comments. A few things I do want to address. There's a few conversations going on there. Of course, as you mentioned, Tammy, winter does take care of some weeds for us, of course, that we don't have to worry about.
Yep.
But winter, some thrive. They need that vernalization period to actually come back in the spring, bigger and better. And of course, as you mentioned, sometimes tillage is what some would go to potentially control some of these weeds. But as you mentioned, sometimes that just spreads them. Or what have you done to your soil health potentially if you've started depending on tillage to try and control some weeds? These are all things that we have to balance and all the things that we have to take into consideration. Now, as you mentioned, Tammy, of course, with weed staging, but Gord is out of Ontario, I believe. But he makes the point that some weeds become a very small target for herbicide after the combine goes through. And
Yes.
so, Rob, if we're looking after harvest, Ken did mention in his clip, being able to identify what's there, maybe talk about those escapes. But how important is it to know what you have on the ground post harvest, but also making sure you can actually get decent control?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess it all starts with the combine. You have to have that even spread, that chaff pattern, spread out that entire width of the header, because we've seen in a lot of our fields where they don't have the chaff, a 35-foot head or a 40-foot head, it doesn't spread out the entire way, and you actually get, heavy residue right behind the combine. You go in there with your herbicide application, those weeds are underneath that heavy residue, and they just kind of blow right through it. And by the time you try to control it in the spring, they have a massive root system on them. So that would probably be the first step, making sure your combine is set up properly. And then it also depends on when you're harvesting. Are you harvesting dry beans or soybeans? You should be putting in winter wheat after a dry bean crop. But if you're not planting anything after soybeans, they come off, September 20th. You have probably, at least in Ontario, 2-3 weeks till the ground's actually frozen. Sometimes the ground doesn't freeze till after Christmas in January. So, if the ground's not frozen, those weeds are still germinating. And the last couple of years, if you kind of look back where we haven't had stope cover at Christmas, we actually have, chickweed still germinating at Christmas time. So that's still going to be competing with the crop the next year. So number one thing would be see what you're growing next year. And then based on, when you actually harvest it. We still recommend, even after corn harvest, there's a lot of residue there, but if you know that there's a heavy field there and you heavy weed infestation, you get the crop off, November 1st, you still have that opportunity to do that fall weed management.
All right. And so Jason has a question here. And this one, Tammy, he actually has two, but this one I think is a really important one to discuss is, so where we're at now, of course, in Manitoba, Jason's in Manitoba as well, with regrowth of, let's say, crop, but we could be talking weeds as well. Do we let Mother Nature kill it off with frost or not? Especially when moisture's limited, right?
Yes. So this is like the crazy hot matrix or those types of things. There's return on investment for both sides of this. So you have made a few comments and I've started writing things down so that I try and remember things that I'm supposed to say. So I know I'm getting there, right? So snert is something I don't like. So after soybeans, we usually see a lot of snert in the ditches. So snow dirt. Yeah. Right. Because once it leaves the field, it's no longer soil. Mm-hmm. It's now, my opinion. And so snert is something that we like to avoid. And so when we're thinking about that, and then we're looking at regrowth of the crop, that can act as something else that I'm a big fan of. And that's something that I like to do after soybeans, which is try a cover crop to try and keep that soil in the field and have a way of competing against some of those weeds that can be out there and eliminate that. So one of the other things that I wanted to mention, we know that when we have a crop like canola or wheat, where there is no inherent dormancy in that field, that a nice light tillage in the fall, heavy harrow even kind of scenario where we just tickle it in, get it to germinate, is fantastic for a couple of reasons. It reduces the volunteers that you have the next year, so they're no longer a weed next year. They're now that cover crop for this fall, which keeps your soil in place and can actually help as far as reducing loss of soil moisture, trapping some snow, doing some really nice things there. So you can utilize that to your benefit. The challenge is how much soil moisture reserve do you have? And can you afford to do that? And also, what do you have for nutrients? And knowing that when you allow that crop to grow and that uptake of nutrients, that's probably not going to break down and be available for the crop use next year. So as long as you're willing to, balance some of those things out, you can make a pretty educated guess based on your previous farming experiences, whether it's more beneficial to leave some of the annual weeds or volunteer crop to grow, or whether you need to terminate them. And typically I would say if it's something that's not going to make seed set, then I'm going to let it grow and have that as something that's competing against the weeds, and something that's not really necessarily needed to be terminated with another herbicide pass. So save that for another day, the next season, that sort of idea.
Now, Rob, one thing I see here in Ontario, of course, I see winter wheat come off, and then it regrows, and all I want to do is put my sheep on it because there's a heck of a lot of regrowth happening, and somebody didn't put a cover crop on. And I've actually seen a farmer mow it, but just like flail mow it, not like harvest it or anything. Is it okay to just let regrowth be your cover crop here in Ontario? Although I do question why you wouldn't put something more intentional in, but can you do that?
Absolutely. Mother Nature doesn't like bare soil, right? So it's going to create its own cover crop. So I personally like going in there and, interseeding something like oats, because you get a heavier seeding rate down there. You get better crop coverage as well. So crop canopy there too, to kind of help shade out the weeds. If you're only relying on that winter wheat there as a cover crop, you're going to see a lot of weeds start to blow through, and then you're starting to have those weed seeds go to seed. So I like going in there and even just thickening that up a little bit. Both oats and winter wheat are fairly easy to kill. And probably the person with the flail mower was just trying to clip some of the weeds there too. So it's probably had some extra time on their hands, but that's a fairly common practice kind of as we move to the Southwest region, clipping some of those tough to control weeds. So, and not just relying only on chemicals. So that's another effective mode of action. But like Tammy said, and even just like the combine going through, it's just going to clip them. They're still going to regrow. We see Canna flea bane just regrow from the stem. And when you think about it at that time of year, that's a pretty large root system on it. So it's tough to actually get good penetration there.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it true that you're allergic to grazing animals in Southern Ontario? No, I'm just kidding.
We must be.
Anyway, I'm sure that you are. Anyway, okay. Now, Tammy, you can tell Jason no if you want. But he says, have Tammy talk about kochia after harvest and regrowth in seed production. So same idea, and we've talked about this a little bit. But kochia is what Canada fleabane and water hemp is to Ontario. It is, quote unquote, the bane of our existence. So
is that a fleabane pun of some sort?
Yes, that is 100%. Yeah. Thank you for getting
well done.
Yeah, thanks. Anyway, there are very few weed puns. Anyway, so but this is one of those things, like you said. I mean, it's a tumbleweed, so it spreads. We've got multiple herbicide resistance. So of course, regrowth, can it set seed even if you cut it off? Let's say you swathed or whatever, you actually cut it. It will regrow and set seed.
Yeah, for sure. And so sometimes that flail mower that Rob was talking about, or that you were talking about and disparaging, can actually be something that is helpful. One of the reasons why you might not want to graze something on there might be because of nitrate levels. So sometimes there are some challenges with grazing those types of things. So we have livestock, you have livestock, we share some common interests there, but nonetheless, there are some challenges as far as utilizing that, as well as, so we have a piece of land at home that we use for winter feeding and some fall grazing and that sort of thing. Some of the compaction issues and then some of the seed return, you do get more weed issues there than you solve sometimes. So the challenges with that sort of thing. But as far as the kochia, so Jason's referring to a study out of Montana where they did find that between the end of July and, when there was that killing frost, whatever temperature that might be for kochia, -5, whatever it is, that super hard frost that gets rid of everything, you can get, like I mentioned, and Jason was clearly not listening, up to about 4,000 seeds per plant. In Alberta, in drier conditions, they did a study, and I think it was 2015. They didn't get the same levels of seed set, but again, it depends on your growing conditions and that sort of thing. So there are different amounts of regrowth that can happen. And again, we don't have that weather machine that you were talking about, so we can't, or crystal ball, so we can't necessarily predict what's going on. So it becomes a risk assessment, whether you allow it to grow and hope that it's just going to catch some snow and not set seed, or whether you get rid of it in one way or another and reduce that seed return. The great thing about Kochia, unlike some of the others, is that that seed doesn't last in the seed bank for very long. So good, Jason. I'm glad that you were listening. That's fantastic. I feel a lot better now. But yeah, so Kochia, most of it germinates the next year. And so that's fantastic. But some of those others, like if you look at lamb's quarters, or you look at red root pigweed, or the water hemp, which we only dabble in Manitoba, those last a lot longer, have a harder seed coat, are more durable. And so, or wild oats, for instance, those ones, it's more important to try and minimize the seed set, whatever way that you may be able to do that. One of the other things, if I just pivot back to that hard frost, and then back to stuff that Mike was talking about as far as in your winter wheat, looking at that weed control of, say, perennial sow thistle versus some of the annual weeds like lamb's quarters, that hard frost for winter annuals like narrow-leaved hawksbeard and flaxweed is a lot colder and more sustained amount of -5 or -8 temperature than, say, wimpy little lamb's quarters that can get killed off pretty easily in the fall. So depending on what it is, whether it's Canada thistle that gets hit by frost, or that shepherd's purse, flaxweed, narrow-leaved hawksbeard, all those, you need to go out into the field and assess what you have for green leaf material. Make sure that you have good green, actively growing weeds, so that if you are using a chemical, that it will be effective. Otherwise, you're wasting your time and your money as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, most of you, sorry, Rob, just quickly, most of you have noticed I didn't get to the third clip. But it was about, I know, fall weed control in a dry year, which of course much of the prairies is still dealing with, but it did mention a discussion on carryover. So I do want to talk about that, Tammy, from your perspective, but Rob, now you go, and then we're going to come back to the carryover question.
I'll go really fast. So just to build on Tammy's comment there on the hard frost and something like perennial sow thistle, at least in Ontario, we actually wait till after that first frost event because that actually triggers the plant to go into winter mode and winter survival mode. So we actually get probably about 30% more activity and better control on the sow thistle, especially perennial sow thistle, which has been a big issue in a lot of our corn crops the last couple of years, since the group 27s aren't as good on it. So definitely after that first frost, is the best time to spray some of those weeds, because they are going in winter survival mode. And then also make sure to add the adjuvants after that frost, since it is cooler temperatures there as well. And after that first frost, try to wait 24 hours if you can, but at least spray in the middle of the day, let it warm up a little bit more for better uptake.
I do want to just, for fear of people thinking that I really hate mowing, I would like to state that I would prefer to see regrowth grazed first, but a mower is better than tillage. So I'm just putting it out there that also I'm pretty sure he just needs something to do. So I'd rather a farmer, if he's looking for something to do, use a mower than a plow. So
they're probably doing the mower before the tillage. So.
No, it's entirely possible, actually. All right, but I'll just pretend like it wasn't. Okay, so very quickly though, and a month ago we probably could have done an entire show on herbicide carryover risks for 2022. I'm not saying that risk is not gone, because it well and truly in several areas is going to be a huge issue, and maybe carryover from 2 seasons ago, depending on how long it's been dry. But my question, Tammy, and it's okay to not know all the answers, but just from the perspective of, it's my understanding that herbicide carryover, we calculate rainfall in season is what contributes to herbicide breakdown. So we still have a bit of season left, and parts of Manitoba, some parts of Alberta, stuff like that are getting some water. Is that going to be enough to make herbicide carryover a non-issue in 2022, or do we still need to be cautious?
Oh, we still need to be cautious. Absolutely. So the label is usually fairly good at indicating the minimum amount of rainfall that's required in season. There's some caveats to that, I'm going to say. So when you get 2 inches of rain, and then you have 2 weeks of hot, dry weather, and then another 2 inches of rain, and then, a month of hot, dry weather, that 4 inches that you accumulated there isn't the same as if you got a few rains along the way that are nice and keep the soil damp, and you've got good field capacity, and you have those microbes having a little party down in the soil, and they're, the hydrolysis needs water. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of the chemical nature of that, but hydrolysis and water are important. So if it's breaking down through hydrolysis, water is required. And if you don't have any soil moisture in that area, then you're not going to be able to break down the herbicide. If it's a clay or high organic matter soil and it's very dry, then we have certain herbicides that adsorb to that. Then they're not readily available even when it does rain. They're not back in soil solution. And if they're not back in soil solution, the microbes can't eat them as well because they're still stuck on the soil or the organic matter. So there's lots of factors here. The microbes don't rebound immediately as soon as it rains. I think, that visual of the desert where it rains and then everything starts to bloom and everything's happy and rosy. That's not really what happens in the soil. From what I understand, the microbes take a while to rebound and all that kind of jazz. So lots of factors there. While we can use that benchmark of accumulated precipitation as a gauge as to whether we may have a risk or not, you still need to know your soil type, your organic matter, the actual rainfall in that field when you applied it. Because if you applied something in July, those June rains don't care, right? Like that doesn't help with the breakdown of that. And then the soil temperature is also important. So right now we're still warm enough, but once we drop below 10 degrees, just like when we do that late application of herbicide and we might get some extended control in the spring when the soil is below 10 degrees Celsius, those microbes are also going to hibernate when the soil is below 10 degrees Celsius. So no more herbicide breakdown will happen. So that's why we look at that June to September 1st kind of timeline as when we assess how much soil or how much moisture there's been and whether we're going to have some issues in the next year, but it's not perfect. And so, yeah, there's lots to talk about on that one. We can maybe save it for a rainy day.
And as Tammy mentioned,
I see what you did there.
And as Tammy mentioned too, it's usually that rain in that first month after application. So if you sprayed in July, you never got much rain in that first 30 days, then very minimal breakdown occurred. Whereas if you get that 2-inch rain right after, it tends to be work a little bit faster.
Rob, what are the biggest concerns we have in Ontario for carryover? Which ones cause the biggest issues?
Well, depends on which crop, but number one would be the group 27s in the corn. If we, a couple years ago, if we get a late spring, we spray our post-emerge group 27s in, end of June, and it doesn't turn, it's fairly dry. We do see some issues on the sandy knolls or on the edible beans or the soybeans or in the overlaps especially. So sand is where we usually see a little bit first, but we don't have the moisture issues like Western Canada. We nonstop putting in tile so we can get rid of the moisture. So, but for the most part, that would be the first one. And then also you have to look at when you are talking about fall weed control, look at the herbicide label because that might limit some of your options for next year. So we do have, some, not to pick on Tammy because I know she works at Corteva, but Lontrell. If you use Lontrell in the fall, you can't plant soybeans or dry beans the next year. You're kind of limited to cereals and corn. So even something like that Canva as well. The later you apply it, the more issues you might run into in the spring if you don't have that breakdown. So know what the follow crop is as well, and even something like Zidua as well. If you are looking at that bluegrass on some of that heavier clay, you might be limited to not planting oats next year as well. So make sure you understand the herbicide label that you're using.
Read the label. Also,
read the label.
I think that's the first time anyone has been like, you might not be able to plant oats. I thought oats were it's like Windex. You just spray it on everything. Ketchup, oats. You just use it.
Increase the seed rate. No. Increase the seed rate.
You just increase your seed rate.
Oats is delicate. Oats is delicate. So we've got a couple of we've got a couple of things in the west that maybe aren't as prevalent in the east, and so there are some of the imadazolinone type herbicides that we definitely have to look at recropping with on that. So Clearfield canola, if you've sprayed it and you've used certain chemistries, then there's probably some issues there. And give me a call anytime to talk about that one, because we'll definitely be talking about it through the winter. Absolutely with clopyralid, anything with clopyralid, whether it's one of our products like Prestige or whether it's Momentum or anything along those lines, curtail them. We need to make sure that we've got all of that under control. And there are some of those group 27s and some other group 2s that we probably need to look at as well. Again, the label is certainly helpful in directing that. The guide to crop protection, not something that you guys talk about over in Ontario, but we certainly have a table in there that looks at recropping intervals for certain things and flags some of them. It's not perfect. It doesn't have everything 100%, but reading the label or checking with your agronomist, whoever that is, you can flag the play and make sure that those special circumstances are that you make the right decision for those fields specifically. They may be not as flexible as some of the others that you have on the farm.
Yeah, for sure.
Sugar beets is always a good indicator crop. So.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Or cucumbers.
Sugar beet. Oh, yeah. Actually, pumpkins are very much my, did we get even a hint of frost? Because the pumpkin leaves just go anyway.
Yes.
And that's the technical term. Yeah. Also, yes, in the West we have, thank you. The guide to crop protection. But then as Rob mentioned once, Pub 75, there's all these pubs, but they're not drinking pubs. They are publications.
I know, much to my disappointment. I've Googled it a few times for trying to get there, and it's a lot of reading.
There are no directions. Yeah, it's just reading. So there you go. Okay, we are out of time, and apologies to Neil Harker, who was in that clip, and it was from years ago, and I kind of wish I did get a chance. But hey, we'll add it into the post. This post will be up tomorrow on realagriculture.com. And so if you really want to watch the clip with Neil Harker, you can. But thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Rob. This has been fantastic. Of course, everyone, thank you in the comments for joining us. Yes, Ray. Everyone is welcome. Lots of learning, lots of discussion. Thank you for your questions. And as we mentioned, the Agronomists will not be back next week, but we will be back September 13th. And I did want to mention, if anyone's got ideas that they want us to cover or ideas for any guests that they'd like to see, we're always open to suggestions. But yes, Rob, Tammy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers, everybody.